Alright everyone, we're going to try something relatively new today, Viva book reviews, because I just finished reading, or at the very least listening to on Audible, E.B. Sledge's With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa. For those of you who don't know, it was made clear in the book, Peleliu is like the lesser-known Okinawa battle in the islands off the Pacific, off of Japan. The dirtiest, nastiest, harshest, most horrific fighting at close combat that existed in the war. Okinawa is the better-known version of it. Peleliu is, if not more horrendous, because I don't know how you compare these things, at the very least equally as horrendous but lesser known. E.B. Sledge, by the way, his name is Eugene Bondurant Sledge, Bondurant, and I didn't know what his middle name was when reading the book. I looked it up afterwards, just found out what it was. And it's a very fitting middle name because durant in French means during, and it comes from the term enduring. Bondurant is sort of like a good lasting, a good enduring individual. Considering he survived the horrors that he described in his memoir, nomen est omen. The name is an omen, although surviving what he survived at some point becomes a matter of luck and not a matter of omen or skill, because running through a field with sniper fire and mortars going off all around you, whether you live or die, is a matter of good luck or bad luck. The memoir itself, it's as compelling a read as you can imagine. It's sort of like Full Metal Jacket in structure, in that it starts off with the training and then it goes into the battle, except it goes into the details of the battle. Details, strategic details, which were of less of an interest to me, not because I don't think it's interesting, just because I've never been in the military. I don't have an interest in the military strategery. It's sort of rules of a game that I don't know. So that part I didn't find as interesting or compelling, but the details of what he went through in battle, it's to say it's inhuman or inhumane is an understatement. Growing up, I used to watch a lot of horror movies, and I used to be scared of horror movies. I used to be scared of the supernatural, but I remember one of the darker realizations of my life is realizing that horror movies are not what is truly terrifying. In real life, it's not the supernatural that is terrifying. It is actually human nature that is terrifying. What man is capable of doing to man, that is truly horrifying. And once you realize that the worst things you'll ever see in any supernatural horror movie pale in comparison to the things that humans have done to humans and will continue to do to humans because of what human nature is. One thing the book did not really go into that I would have been not more interested in again, but would have been more compelling to me, is the transition back to civilian life, because that is the training that goes into getting these men ready to fight the dirtiest and most vicious combat, to get them to be able to actually kill another human being at close range. We're not talking about bombing at a distance, which is a little more disconnected, a little more impersonal. We're not talking about, sniper fire at a distance, which, although intimate, is a little more impersonal, detached. We're talking about what they described in the book, soldiers digging foxholes on the island, and Japanese soldiers would run raids in the middle of the night and jump into these foxholes to try to kill American soldiers, hand-to-hand combat, knives. One scene in the book describes how an American soldier killed a Japanese soldier who was running a raid on the foxhole by sticking his fingers in through his eyes. That is how close and gritty the combat was. And certain images stick with you in reading the horror stories of hand-to-hand combat. That was one of them. Another one that stuck with me from the book was, spoiler alert, but I mean, we've seen this in movies, we know it exists, but when you read it and it's someone's recounting of their own experience, where they're digging their foxholes, and this was on Okinawa, that had been enduring fighting for much longer. The casualties were exponentially higher than on Peleliu, and the terrain that they describe on Okinawa was a muddy terrain where they had to dig foxholes, versus on Peleliu it was mostly a coral reef or a hard base, so you couldn't really dig foxholes. which posed its problems on Okinawa, but it also created this situation, one scene from the book where they're digging foxholes in so much carnage and so much death and destruction that E.B. Sledge describes how he came into contact with a corpse that had either been deliberately buried or accidentally buried by dirt, and when he hit the sternum or the chest, punctured it, and maggots, he said, crawled out like they were being squeezed out of the body. Endless horror that you cannot possibly imagine. And one of the other things that struck me from the book was the description of how some soldiers cracked, literally just snapped under the pressure. Psychotic breaks, mental breakdowns, talking gibberish, mumbling, screaming. And there was one scene in the book where one soldier just snapped in the dead of the night when they were on, I believe it was Peleliu, and was risking giving away their location to the enemy soldiers, and this soldier's comrades were trying to calm him down, trying to get him to come back to reality, and he was screaming gibberish to the point where they struck him, then they hit him on the head with a shovel, and in the morning, he's dead. And it's unimaginable what people went through. It's unimaginable what they had to go through. And, the word that Sledge used in the book often was pity, and what a waste, because that's what it was, but it's a simplistic way of describing it, but it can't be more poignant. It's just a waste. People cut down in the prime of their lives, the healthiest people with the brightest futures out there, literally wasted on some ridge, on some island in the middle of the Pacific for some war that the adults of the world are waging. And waste and pity were the perfect ways of describing it. And it also just reminded me of that scene in Braveheart at the end of the movie where, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen Braveheart, where he gets killed. And you always hope that he's going to be able to make it out. You always hope that he's going to survive, even though it's, hundreds of years later, you know that he would have been dead one way or the other. But the moment when they begin to disembowel him, you realize that that's it. It's over. It's done for. It's just wasted. It's all written. And when you see that day in and day out in the most horrendous conditions, far from home, far from the ones you love, I don't know how anyone survives that spiritually or psychologically. And the human trauma element of that is what I would have wanted to hear more about in the book, but I appreciate that was not the purpose of the memoirs of E.B. Sledge, although he did touch on it. The return to civilian life, how soldiers had difficulty, to say the least, reintegrating, getting back to civilian life. At one point he was talking about how soldiers that got injured and went back to civilian life, all that they wanted to do was get back to war, get back to the people that they lived, died, fought with, because they so could not relate to anyone in the home back home who had not experienced what they experienced, that all they wanted to do was get back to battle, even if it meant likely or surefire death. And it's a traumatic thing to even try to conceptualize. At one point in the book, E.B. Sledge referenced a poem by Siegfried Sassoon, and I'm going to read that poem in its entirety just not to destroy it and to do it justice. The poem is exquisitely beautiful, exquisitely heartbreaking, and exquisitely insightful. Suicide in the Trenches by Siegfried Sassoon. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray, you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. In his memoir, E.B. Sledge only referenced the third paragraph of that poem, and it's only when I looked it up online that I read the poem in its entirety, and it was even more impactful. But it gives you an insight into what E.B. Sledge went through when he returned to civilian life, and I looked up his biography after having read the book, and he did indeed have great difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. He had to give up hunting altogether. One of the stories was after a dove hunt with his father caught him weeping, and he said, I just can't stand to cause destruction anymore. And he gave up hunting, but his father said you could get into bird watching, which would be a good way to maintain the hobby without the destruction, without causing pain and anguish, which is what he did. He went on to study zoology and teach at a university. So he managed to get through all of this. He managed to survive and thrive in as much as he ever could. One poignant part of the book is when E.B. Sledge heard a voice in his head that said, "You will survive the war, and you have to make your survival meaningful for all of your brothers who fell in battle." And by all accounts, he did just that. And I don't know how he did just that, because when we're living in the world in which we're living today, where, people are fighting to cancel Halloween to be more inclusive and out of sensitivities to others, when you look back at what people had to go through in order to provide this very freedom to this world. And like the poem, people are smiling gleefully. They have no idea, no appreciation for what some had to go through to provide them the freedoms and the privileges that they benefit from, so that they can quibble over meaningless things. And that is the ultimate takeaway from the book, and I suspect that that's part and parcel of the title, with the old breed, where, the new breed is a little different than the old breed, because they did not sit in the foully stench of death and decay. They did not have to kill and be killed. They know nothing of that, and it's the type of thing that you probably can never, in any meaningful sense, relate to unless you've experienced it or something like it. And that is two worlds colliding when the soldier returns home and sees people, worrying, concerned over nonsense, when they went through absolute hell to give them that privilege, that freedom. So that is the book review. From what I understand, also the book was made into several mini-series, which were compelling, that I've been told to watch, and I will. But that is the book review of E.B. Sledge, Peleliu and Okinawa. It's a must-read. It's a must-read. It may not have gotten into the reintegration into civilian society that I would have wanted it to, but that's just another book that I'll have to pull up. This gives a detailed account, a traumatizing account to listen to, of what the best and the brightest of our generation, or of our millennia, century, had to go through, because other people determined that this was what was necessary in order to provide the freedoms that we currently enjoy, and that some might feel the freedoms that we are currently squandering away. All right, stay tuned for episode 2, book to be determined. Peace out, everyone.